In this episode, we'll explore the subject of academic resource management, why it's essential to today's universities and colleges, and what crucial information you may be missing to lead your institution towards a sustainable future.
That is precisely why I invented the term academic resourcing, because yes, the costing models are often set up and managed by accountants, but the decisions that drive the costs have to be made by faculty, deans, provosts, and so forth. They certainly are strategic. They're probably the most powerful strategic tool that we have in our toolbox. We got to do things very differently in the post-COVID environment.
You are listening to Pilbara Insights, the podcast, the first dedicated audio series to support higher education leaders in their academic resource management decisions. The series will showcase the industry's most respected and experienced experts, explore the topics of program review and optimization, course evaluation, faculty effort, departmental research, planning and budgeting, and the key benefits of activity-based cost modelling for evidence-based decision-making.
Hello and welcome to our very first episode of Pilbara Insights. Today I'm honoured to be joined by Professor Bill Massy. Hi Bill.
Hello Lee, how are you today?
I am super duper. Bill and I have actually known each other for about 7 years now. We met each other down in Melbourne as part of the L.H. Martin Institute Leading Universities program, where we were using our predictive model to help with those who were in the course learning how to run universities. And Bill was there as well as a guest from the US to help teach those students how to run those universities. That was a pretty good course that they ran, wasn't it?
Yes, that was a great session. Really opened my eyes as to the possibilities, and it was just great to see people engaged.
And today we're actually going to be discussing Bill's new book called Resource Management for Colleges and Universities. And to start with, Bill, can you explain to us what academic resource management is?
Well, it is the process of determining what resources go to what academic programs and in what ways. So it's the heart of the university. It encompasses everything from the number of faculty you have to how they're distributed amongst departments to other kinds of research support and so forth. So it's pretty much everything on the academic side of the university.
And how does that relate to cost and cost management?
Well, there are two things that you really have to worry about when you're looking at resourcing. First is the physical resources themselves, that is numbers of faculty, numbers of classes, programs, student enrollments, and so forth. And then there's the economic consequences of all of those things. And every one of those things will have an economic consequence one way or the other. And when we're talking about the cost side or the supply side, we're talking about the cost of a faculty member or the cost of a course. There's also, of course, a revenue side that tends to follow the student. The cost side tends to follow the courses and the departments and so on.
Yeah. And in fact, because every time we talk about costing and cost modelling, one of the questions we get back, or one of the thoughts that most people have, is that costing resides with the accountants, with the financial side of the house. What is the difference between the financial management and academic resource management?
Okay, Lee, that is precisely why I invented the term academic resourcing. Because yes, the costing models are often set up and managed by accountants, but the decisions that drive the costs have to be made by faculty, academics, deans, provosts, and so forth. Because they're the ones that are out there. They know what they're trying to do. They know what the objectives are. They know about student learning and research and so forth. And so they're the ones that deploy the resources. What they need to do, though, when they make those deployments, is they have to understand something about what they're going to cost. And not only that, they have to compare the costs of the changes they're making with the changes in revenue. And if you got the revenue and the cost, of course, you have the margins. So it's only the academics that can make the decisions and evaluate the results. The cost accountants are very important, but they're in a support role. They keep the machine running, but they don't actually make the decisions.
And that's something that's interesting. Another point that's been raised is that universities have been around for hundreds of years without having the types of models that we have built. So how did they used to do this, and why is it important now to actually implement these types of models?
Okay, well, I'm going to give answer in two stages. The first is pre-COVID, and I imagine you can guess that the second will be post-COVID. But for hundreds of years, basically, faculty, I'm going to use the term faculty, and when I say that, by the way, I mean faculty members, department chairs, even deans, the academics, working academics, if you will. They were concerned mainly with getting the resources that they could get and doing the best job they could with them. And in fact, when I was acting provost at Stanford one year, talking with a dean, and I was asking him, well, what do you think about the balance of cost and revenue and so forth, and margin? How do you look at your margins? And this dean, who happens to be one of our biggest schools, the Humanities and Science School, actually, he looked at me and said, Bill, you don't understand. My job is not to balance costs and revenues and money and quality and activities. My job is to persuade you to give me all that you could give me and then spend it as well as I can. And that means getting the best faculty I could get and getting out of their way, letting them do their thing. Well, that worked as long as the resources were available.
Yep.
And that, frankly, has broken down over the years precisely because it was a successful strategy early on. And so costs keep going up in that scenario. And that, to my mind, is one of the strongest reasons as why the cost of higher education keeps climbing. It's because the people who are out there making the decisions on how to teach and do research and so forth don't balance costs and revenues. They just keep putting on the pressure for more and more expenditure, which then puts on the pressure for more and more revenue. And they spend it pretty wisely, I think, by and large. But the effect is that the revenues, the tuition rates, and so forth keep going. The post-COVID answer is that process not only didn't work well in the past, but it's manifestly, it fails now. And the reason is we got to do things very differently in the post-COVID environment. And we can't just continue going along the same track that we've been going on. And in order to figure out what track we should be on, how to develop our hybrid teaching methods, how to develop our changes in program mix, how to balance faculty and other kinds of inputs. And so we have to actually be able to study alternative approaches to these things. And in order to do that studying, we have to understand the costs as well as the results.
Yep.
And so maybe we didn't have to do that in the past. We have to do it now.
Yeah, because I know universities here in Australia are suffering financially due to COVID because of the drop in international students. And that's a big revenue source for a lot of universities here in Australia. But globally, universities are struggling financially because of the COVID. Things like, having to rapidly move all their courses online and the additional costs involved in that. And some of the things we've seen is that the academics have to spend more time online teaching these courses, which adds to the cost of that course, or insofar as they can't then spend other time doing research, which is something else that they would be doing if they weren't supporting the students, or working overtime and putting a lot of stress on the academic staff during this pandemic.
Absolutely. And what's happening is universities are dealing with this in the post-COVID world, and they're making changes. But the question is whether those changes can be sustainable. Faculty can do this more intense work and work the much longer hours, could do it all in the short run. They're very good about that.
Yep.
But they can't do it on an ongoing basis. And so having made kind of gross adjustments in the post-pandemic world, we then have to go back and restructure what goes on inside at a more granular level so that we don't get faculty burnout. We don't get growing deficits, and we don't get problems of deferred liabilities and so forth building up. So unless we can reconfigure our institutions so that things really are in balance.
And a sustainable enterprise is actually a really good point, because they can make immediate changes to address the current crisis, but what changes do they need to make to ensure a financially sustainable institution in the long run? With the types of models that you're talking about, do you consider them to be more strategic tools or tactical operational type tools?
Well, I think they're both. I really do think they're both. They certainly are strategic. They're probably the most powerful strategic tool that we have in our toolbox, because we can look at scenarios for different kinds of university configurations, and we can adjust programs and courses and teaching modes and teaching instances. All the things that are in the model can in fact be adjusted to build these scenarios, and then we can try different ones and decide which ones make the most sense. That's clear. But also the tactical, the operational side of it, these models are really useful for people in departments. If you're trying to plan for short-term enrollment changes, you're trying to plan for the next semester, for example, you've got to decide what courses to offer. You've got to decide how they're going to be configured and so on and so forth. The models can really help a lot in that. Provosts, for example, looking also at next year's budgets, which I consider to be an operational rather than a strategic thing. The models are just absolutely wonderful. They really do a tremendous job in helping determine the following year's budgets. So yes, it's both.
Yep. And just going back to your point on the deans of the schools using these types of models, particularly for the models where it includes all the overhead, some of the feedback that I get from some of our institutions is that, particularly from the deans, is that we can't control that overhead. So do we need to include that in their models for them to be able to manage their schools?
Yes, I think for two reasons. Overhead is helpful for a couple of reasons. First, the overhead, when you have the overhead modeling capability, you can see where the costs are coming from. And you can, if you're a dean, you can argue back against the provost about the size of certain costs. And I think deans really find that to be very important. But even more fundamentally than that, there are certain kinds of decisions where you want to look at incremental cost. Many decisions, maybe even most decisions at the decanal level, you want to look at incremental costs and incremental revenue and incremental margins. That's contribution margins and so forth at the course or the program or department level. But you also have to make pricing decisions. Or somebody within the institution does, and often the dean is involved in that to some extent. And the rule of thumb in economics is for allocation decisions, you use incremental cost. You don't really need overhead, although maybe some of the overhead is variable, so you may want to consider that. But if you're going to make pricing decisions, you have got to have your allocated overhead. Otherwise, you end up not recovering your full costs and you're not sustainable financially.
No, that's exactly right. And I think transparency is important as well. And as I keep saying, it's, high cost isn't necessarily bad cost. Hidden cost is the enemy. And if they don't know what that full cost is, then they don't know, as you rightly pointed out, whether the tuition they're charging is actually covering not only the direct cost, but also the overhead as well.
And we can add fees in on tuition, and those sometimes can be targeted to particular areas. But again, you need to have the overhead in order to make those decisions.
And we know that not every program covers all its costs, and there are cross-subsidies within an institution. And if those particular programs are core to the mission of the organisation, then at least they know what they need to do to actually subsidise that particular program.
Absolutely.
So the other big question I get, and particularly now, given the pandemic, is that the model is looking at historic data. Even though, we do have a predictive model, but we won't go into that in this discussion. But with the historic model, they're saying, can we really use that now, given that things are changing so much?
Well, I think the answer is yes. And it's precisely because the model gets down to such a granular level. You can't use an aggregate model now. A model that, say, tracks time trends and departmental expense and things that's the sort of normal thing that people do. They don't work at all once things have changed. All bets are off. But when you have a structural model, a granular structural model, and the Pilbara model is that, get down to the level of the individual course instance, and the structure involves the kinds of inputs, faculty, resources, technology, and so forth. That is much less changeable as the world changes. Or if it does, you have a leg up on figuring out how to change the model to take account of it. And these models, by the way, what we always use them for is they don't tell us what to do. They change our conversations about what to do.
Yep.
They inform our planning conversations and our operational discussions and so forth. And somebody will say something like, well, such and such at the level of this course has changed, and therefore it's because you have a granular model. Instead of throwing up your hands and saying the model isn't going to help, you go into the model structure and you change a parameter, or if necessary, you can even change the whole structure. And that's how you inform these conversations.
Yeah. And in fact, just based on what we were saying before, with changes due to the pandemic, we can actually change, in particular, things like the academic profiles, so the amount of time they spend teaching versus research. And we know that it does increase with online teaching as well.
Yeah, perfect example. You can compensate for the online teaching within the faculty or within the course. In this case, it's the course profiles. Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Bill.
Okay, thanks, Lee. Hey, this has been great. I look forward to the next one. ones, and keep calm and let's carry on.
No worries. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
You have been listening to Pilbara Insights, the podcast, the first dedicated audio series to support higher education leaders in their academic resource management decisions.
Pilbara Group would like to give special thanks to Emeritus Professor William F. Massy for his valuable work and contribution to today's podcast. Thank you also to all our listeners. If you'd like to learn more, visit our website www.pilbaragroup.com and stay tuned for the next episode of Pilbara Insights, the podcast, coming soon.